In 1940, when Luftwaffe bombs rained down on London, everyone thought the royal family would flee. But one woman stood firm, looked directly into the muzzles of the Nazi guns, and said, "No." Why did a woman with a gentle smile strike more fear into Adolf Hitler than any general? Let's unravel the life of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the reluctant savior of the British monarchy. The narrative arc of Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon, the woman destined to become the most beloved yet formidable matriarch in British history, finds its soul not within the gilded, stifling corridors of Buckingham Palace, but amidst the haunting, mist-shrouded battlements of Glamis Castle in the Scottish lowlands. Born in 1900 as the ninth child of the Earl of Strathmore Elizabeths, childhood was a vivid tapestry of ancient legends, secret rooms, and a ruggedly independent, aristocratic lifestyle that was light years away from the rigid, performative etiquette of the London court. Glamis was a fortress of memory, rumored to house a secret monster and countless ghosts. And it was within these thick stone walls that the young Elizabeth developed a constitution as durable as Scottish granite. She was a child of the earth and the wind, free to explore hidden passageways and engage with the local staff, farmers and villagers, with a natural, unaffected warmth that would later become her most potent political weapon. This was no delicate hothouse flower. She was a girl who understood the rhythms of the land and the weight of history. Her upbringing provided a hidden grit, a silent, unbreakable resilience that remained invisible to the high society observers of her youth. While the world saw only a charming, dark-haired debutante with a radiant smile, the wild air of Scotland had already forged the spirit of a warrior. Little did the British establishment realize that this girl, raised far from the suffocating expectations of the throne, was quietly cultivating the iron-willed psychological strength necessary to one day stand as the primary human shield against the apocalyptic machinery of the Third Reich. Her youth was not merely a time of play, but a profound training ground for survival, teaching her that true leadership was not found in following dusty protocols, but in standing immovable when the terrifying winds of a global cataclysm began to howl. This rugged upbringing in the shadow of Macbeth's castle instilled in her a sense of historical destiny, a feeling that she was part of a lineage that did not break under pressure, a lineage that viewed the crown not as a prize but as a heavy ancestral duty to be borne with a silent, smiling ferocity. In the early 1920s, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon performed an act of social defiance that sent shockwaves through the upper echelons of the British establishment. She twice flatly rejected a formal marriage proposal from Prince Albert, the Duke of York, the second son of the formidable King George V. To the outside world, refusing a prince of the blood was madness. But for Elizabeth, it was a desperate act of self-preservation. She was a creature of liberty, a vibrant soul who cherished her privacy, her spontaneity, and her ability to walk through life without the crushing weight of public expectation. When she looked at the British royal family, she did not see a pinnacle of glamour or prestige. She saw a golden cage, a suffocating, airless vault of endless, repetitive duty designed to methodically stifle individuality and silence the human spirit. She possessed a terrifyingly clear foresight, fearing that by placing a royal crown upon her head, she would irrevocably lose the very essence of the woman Bertie loved. The light in her eyes would be extinguished by 1,000 meaningless ceremonies. She saw how the institution had crushed the spirits of those before her, turning vibrant individuals into hollow symbols of state. For years she resisted the relentless allure of the throne, not out of a lack of affection for the stuttering, earnest prince, but because she understood the brutal weight of the crown long before she was ever forced to carry it. It was only through Bertie's pathetic, heart-wrenching persistence and her own realization that she could be the indispensable anchor for a man so clearly overwhelmed by his station that she finally accepted his third proposal in 1923. She did not enter the royal fold as a triumphant social climber seeking power. She entered as a profound and reluctant sacrificial lamb, consciously trading her cherished freedom for a life of grueling service. a sacrifice that would eventually place her at the burning epicenter of a global catastrophe she never sought to lead. We are dedicated to building a digital archive of human resilience, but these deep dives require immense resources. If you value this level of research, please like and subscribe. This tells the algorithm that deep-form history still matters in a world of fleeting content. Help us keep these legends alive. The gears of history took a sharp, jagged, and terrifying turn in 1936 during the infamous Year of Three Kings. A period that plunged the British monarchy into its most existential crisis of the modern era. When King Edward VIII, a man seduced by his own desires and rumored Nazi sympathies, chose his forbidden obsession for the twice-divorced American socialite Vala Simpson over his sacred ancestral duty to the empire, he did more than just abdicate. He effectively threw the crown at his younger brother Albert like a poisoned chalice. This event was a personal and national earthquake of unprecedented magnitude. Elizabeth, who had carefully constructed a quiet, supportive life for herself as a duchess, was suddenly, violently thrust onto a crumbling throne as queen consort. She watched with a mixture of fury and heartbreak as her husband, a man who possessed no desire for power and who suffered from a debilitating, agonizing, nervous stutter, was nearly paralyzed by the sheer weight of his new unwanted responsibilities. The betrayal by Edward, whom Elizabeth would forever blame for shortening her husband's life, was a wound that never healed. In this moment of absolute institutional collapse, Elizabeth did not succumb to panic. Instead, she transformed into the cold strategic architect of the king's survival. She became the woman of steel behind the scenes, providing the emotional and psychological scaffolding that allowed the terrified deterrent, shaking Duke of York to slowly, painfully transform into King George VI. She was the one who sought out the unconventional and often mocked Australian speech therapist Lionel Logue, and she was the one who sat through every grueling, repetitive practice session in the dead of night, fiercely teaching her husband that his voice, however flawed, however broken, was the singular voice of calm that a frightened nation desperately needed to hear as the shadows of war began to lengthen across Europe. In the immediate and toxic aftermath of the abdication, the British monarchy was viewed by many as a dying, out-of-touch relic, led by a man seen as a spare and a weakling compared to his charismatic but disgraced brother. Elizabeth, with her uncanny political instincts, recognized that the traditional displays of royal hard power, the distant cold majesty, and the arrogant silence of the past would lead only to revolution and the end of the crown. Instead, she pioneered the revolutionary use of soft power, a strategy of weaponized empathy. She utilized a simple, radiant, and seemingly tireless smile as a shield to repair the deep, weeping scars left by Edward's selfish departure. She introduced the concept of the royal walkabout, breaking the invisible barriers of protocol to stop and speak with ordinary citizens, touching their hands with a warmth that felt genuine rather than calculated. She listened to their mundane stories with an intensity that made the common person feel like the center of the universe. This was a radical departure from the aloofness of George V or the erratic flamboyance of Edward VIII. This was not merely a public relations exercise, it was a fundamental, strategic rebuilding of the sacred bond between the crown and the people. By humanizing the monarchy, she made it appear not just ornamental, but essential to the British identity. She took the king's very human vulnerability and turned it into a national strength. Presenting their household as a devoted, relatable family, the four of us who were sharing the nation's burdens as equals. This soft power was the chemical glue that held the crumbling institution together during the transition, slowly and methodically turning public resentment into a fierce, protective, and almost fanatical loyalty that would soon be tested in the literal furnaces of a world war. She understood that in the modern age, a monarch could no longer rule by divine right, but only by the consent and affection of the people, and she set out to win that affection with every handshake and every carefully timed appearance. While the corridors of Whitehall were filled with the whispers of peace in our time, and high-ranking politicians were engaging in the tragically diluted policy of appeasement toward the Nazi regime. The Queen was among the very first to recognize the true predatory nature of the dark shadow rising from Berlin. Her instincts, sharpened by the rugged and pragmatic reality of her Scottish youth, told her that Adolf Hitler was not a statesman one could bargain with, but a nihilistic force that understood only strength. She watched with growing alarm as the German chancellor dismantled the Treaty of Versailles and began a systematic program of rearmament that threatened to unbalance the entire world. As she toured the country and hosted cold formal meetings with foreign dignitaries, she observed the unfolding geopolitical landscape through a lens of absolute survival. She saw the massive military buildup and the chilling ideological fanaticism of the Third Reich for exactly what they were: a violent prelude to a global firestorm that would seek to consume everything she held sacred. While her husband, the king, initially and dutifully supported Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's efforts to avoid conflict, even appearing on the balcony with him after the Munich Agreement, Elizabeth's private correspondence and deliberate actions suggested a far more hawkish and realistic stance. She understood with a chilling clarity that a clash of civilizations was not just likely, but inevitable. She viewed Hitler not as a political rival, but as an existential threat to the very concept of Christian civilization. Long before the first air raid sirens wailed across London, she began the grim process of preparing the royal household and her own young daughters for the harsh reality of total war. She was the silent, watchful sentinel of the palace, the first to publicly acknowledge that the comfort of the throne was a fragile illusion and that the crown's ultimate, final duty would soon be to lead a desperate, scorched-earth resistance against a darkness that sought to extinguish the very flame of British liberty. By the early 1940s, as the German war machine began its relentless march across Europe, crushing sovereign nations like dry leaves, a strange and telling report began to circulate within the highest echelons of the Nazi command: Adolf Hitler himself had branded Queen Elizabeth the most dangerous woman in Europe. This was not an insult. It was a recognition of a peerless adversary. It was not because she commanded a single tank or drafted military strategy in the war room, but because Hitler, a master of psychological manipulation himself, recognized in her a supreme and immovable psychological threat. He understood that while the king represented the formal machinery of the state, the Queen had become the living, breathing heart of the British people's morale. Her absolute refusal to be intimidated, her constant, defiant presence in the bombed-out streets, and her unwavering, radiant smile were weapons of mass inspiration that neutralized the entire Nazi propaganda machine. Every time Goebbels tried to paint the British as a defeated, crumbling race, a photograph of the smiling queen in a floral hat would appear, standing amidst the ruins, proving him wrong. Hitler feared the soft power she had perfected. He knew that as long as the British public saw their queen standing tall, unbowed, and smiling amidst the wreckage, they would never, under any circumstances, surrender. To the Führer, she was a psychological fortress that no blitz could breach, a woman whose mere existence inspired a battered nation to keep fighting, even when every military logic and every scrap of intelligence suggested they should have collapsed months ago. She was the antithesis of his new order, a symbol of tradition and quiet, aristocratic defiance that proved to be more resilient and more enduring than all the steel in the Ruhr Valley. She was the guardian of the British psyche. And Hitler knew that as long as she breathed, the spirit of resistance would never die. When the Blitz finally arrived in 1940 and incendiary bombs began to rain down like a biblical plague upon the city of London, turning the night sky into a hellish orange glow, the British government, fearing for the continuity of the monarchy, urgently and repeatedly advised the Queen to flee with her young daughters to the absolute safety of Canada, or at least the remote English countryside. The plan was prepared. The ships were ready. But Elizabeth's response was not a discussion, but a sharp, defiant, three-sentence refusal that would echo through the centuries and change the psychological course of British history. "The children won't go without me." I won't leave the king, and the king will never leave. In this singular moment, the hidden Scottish grit of her youth met the global stage with a thunderous impact. She knew that if the royal family fled, the morale of the nation would vanish instantly. By choosing to remain in the heart of the inferno, Elizabeth irrevocably tied the fate of the House of Windsor directly to the fate of the ordinary terrified Londoner shivering in an Anderson shelter while the ground shook from the weight of German explosives. She refused to seek a sanctuary that was denied to her subjects, effectively declaring that if the British people were to burn, their queen would burn alongside them. This act of radical solidarity transformed the royal family overnight from distant porcelain figures of authority into fellow soldiers on the desperate home front. Her refusal to flee was a massive strategic victory for the Allies. It deprived the Nazis of a humiliating psychological win and gave the British people a tangible, living reason to hold their ground. She became a symbol of the stay-put policy, a mother figure who shared the danger of her children, forging a bond of blood and fire that no enemy could ever hope to sever. On the morning of September 13, 1940, the reality of the war arrived with a terrifying, bone-shaking crash directly on the Queen's doorstep when a lone German bomber dived out of the clouds and dropped several high-pilotes directly onto Buckingham Palace, while the King and Queen were actually in residence having tea. Two of the bombs exploded in the central quadrangle, shattering windows and sending lethal shrapnel flying through the very rooms where the royal couple were standing. The palace was not a safe haven, it was a target. Rather than sparking a panicked retreat or a secret flight to the country, this brush with death became Elizabeth's most profound and enduring public relations victory of the entire war. Shortly after the dust and smoke had settled, and while the smell of cordite still hung in the air, she famously and coolly remarked to her staff, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." This was a masterstroke of political communication. Before this event, a dangerous and growing resentment had been simmering among the working-class citizens of London's East End, the dock workers and laborers who felt the royals were living in a protected ivory tower luxury, while their own neighborhoods were being systematically leveled to the ground. The sight of a damaged smoking palace leveled the social playing field in an instant. It allowed the Queen to visit the most devastated, poverty-stricken neighborhoods, not as a patronizing visitor from another world, but as a fellow survivor of the Luftwaffe. She walked through the smoking rubble of Stepney, her expensive shoes covered in the same gray soot and brick dust as the residents, creating a visceral, unbreakable, and holy bond of shared suffering that effectively silenced the critics of the monarchy for the next 60 years. She had earned her right to lead through shared peril. In a world that had become a nightmare of drab, gray uniforms, blackouts, and the soul-crushing austerity of Nazi-occupied Europe, where every scrap of fabric was rationed and hope was in short supply, Queen Elizabeth made the radical and controversial decision to use her own wardrobe as a meticulously calculated weapon of psychological warfare. She intentionally and stubbornly chose to wear elegant, flowing silk dresses in a rainbow of soft, defiant colors: pinks, lilacs, turquoises, and sunny yellows, during her constant tours of the bombed-out ruins of British cities. When her frantic advisors and government officials suggested she wear more practical, somber, or military-style clothing to match the grim and grieving mood of the nation, she flatly refused to comply. She understood the deep, subconscious psychology of the British public far better than the politicians in their dark suits. She famously explained her reasoning: "If the people come to see me, they put on their best clothes. I must do the same for them." By appearing in her finest, most feminine attire amidst the jagged ruins of civilization, she was projecting a powerful, wordless message of normalcy, beauty, and absolute defiance. She was telling the people that the war would not change who they were. She was a visual middle finger to the entire Nazi regime, a living statement that British culture, grace, and the spirit of the individual would not be diminished or darkened by the terror of the Blitz. Her silk dresses were her true armor, and her signature pearls were her badges of office. providing a much-needed and psychologically vital splash of color in a world that had turned terrifyingly dark and monochrome. She was a beacon of light in a smog-choked city, a reminder that the world they were fighting for still existed. The staggering contrast between the leadership styles of the two opposing forces was never more vividly apparent than during the final, desperate years of the conflict. While Adolf Hitler withdrew further into the bowels of the earth, hiding in an increasingly claustrophobic and delusional underground bunker in Berlin, surrounded by sycophants and maps of imaginary armies, completely disconnected from the burning reality of his crumbling Reich, Queen Elizabeth was a constant, visible presence in the smoking ruins of cities like Coventry and Plymouth. Following the devastating and historic firebombing of Coventry Cathedral, which left the city a graveyard of stone and twisted metal, she stood in the charred, still smoldering remains of the altar, offering a quiet, steady comfort to the dazed survivors. She didn't stay in her car. She walked among the homeless. She touched the wounded. And she looked into the eyes of the bereaved. Her presence in the literal wreckage of the nation's heritage cemented her status as the indestructible mother of Britain. She didn't just offer empty political platitudes or hide behind a radio microphone. She offered a physical, tangible presence that suggested the very foundations of the nation were still intact as long as she was standing there. While the German dictator relied on a system of fear, propaganda, and total isolation to maintain his desperate grip on power, Elizabeth relied on the much more durable forces of empathy, visibility, and shared humanity. This constant presence transformed the British monarchy into a living, breathing symbol of the nation's survival, proving to the world that the true power of a leader is not found in the depth of a bunker or the reach of a secret police force, but in the fearless ability to stand shoulder to shoulder with the people in the absolute midst of their greatest and most terrifying trials. She was the embodiment of the British refusal to break. When the guns of Europe finally fell silent on VE Day in May 1945, and a massive primal roar erupted from the hundreds of thousands of people gathered in a sea of humanity outside Buckingham Palace, it was far more than just a celebration of a military victory over a foreign foe. It was a profound personal triumph for Elizabeth Lyon, as she stood on the famous balcony alongside her husband and a triumphant Winston Churchill. The crowd's deafening adulation was a direct recognition of the woman who had effectively kept the crown's spirit, and by extension, the nation's spirit, alive during the darkest, most hopeless hours of the war. Churchill himself, a man not prone to easy praise and who had seen the heights of human endeavor, privately acknowledged that she was the secret psychological weapon of the entire British war effort. He knew that without her, the king might have cracked under the pressure, and without the king, the nation might have faltered. The military victory belonged to the generals in the field and the millions of soldiers who fought. But the miraculous survival of the British soul and the continuity of its ancient institutions belonged largely to her. She had taken a fragile, scandal-ridden, reclaimed, and widely disliked monarchy and turned it into the immovable, sacred heart of a global resistance against tyranny. The roar of the crowd that day was a national affirmation that her soft power and her hidden Scottish grit had won the ultimate psychological war, ensuring that the British monarchy would emerge from the ashes of the conflict stronger, more relevant, and more deeply beloved than it had been in over a century. It was her coronation as the mother of the nation. The toll of the war, however, was heavy and ultimately lethal for the man she loved. King George VI had never been physically strong, and the relentless stress of the war, the heavy smoking, and the constant burden of the crown had worn him down to a shadow. In 1952, the man Elizabeth had meticulously built into a king, the man she had protected, coached, and supported through a decade of global catastrophe and personal health crises, finally succumbed to the immense strain of his position. He died peacefully in his sleep at the age of only 56, leaving Elizabeth a widow at the relatively young age of 51. The world, and indeed many within the cold, calculating machinery of the palace itself, expected her to follow the traditional path of a queen consort, to retreat into a quiet, somber, and largely invisible retirement of mourning, perhaps living out her days in the country, but they had fundamentally underestimated her yet again. Elizabeth found a way to reinvent herself and her role in the national story, taking on the official title of Queen Mother. This was not just a name, it was a new mandate for power. It allowed her to remain a central, active, and vibrant figure in British public life for the next half-century. She did not just mourn her husband. She recalibrated her entire existence to serve as the mentor, protector, and occasionally the iron hand behind her daughter, the young and inexperienced Queen Elizabeth II. She provided the vital historical bridge between the old imperial world of Victoria and the new, uncertain and rapidly modernizing post-war era. She transitioned from being the woman behind the king to being the grandmother of the nation, using her decades of hard-won experience and her seemingly eternal popularity to provide a sense of continuity and stability during the rapid, often chaotic social and political changes that were about to transform Britain forever. She was the guardian of the flame, ensuring that the lessons of the war were never forgotten by the next generation of royals. In a post-war world defined by rapidly shifting moral values, the painful and systematic dismantling of the British Empire, the rise of the Cold War, and a series of explosive royal scandals that threatened to destabilize the next generation of the monarchy, the Queen Mother remained the immovable, unchanging anchor of tradition. For over 50 years, she was the one constant in a turbulent, churning sea of modernization. She maintained the exact same standards of duty, public grace, and aristocratic stoicism she had forged in the fire of the 1930s, flatly refusing to bend her knee to the whims of modern celebrity culture or the prying eyes of the tabloid press. She was the final repository of the old ways, a living, breathing link to a time when duty to the state was considered paramount over personal happiness. Even as her own grandchildren and the wider royal family faced high-profile divorces, public meltdowns, and devastating controversies in the 1980s and 90s, including the tragic saga of Princess Diana, the Queen Mother remained largely untarnished and above the fray. She was the stabilizing force that held the family together when it threatened to fly apart. Her uncanny ability to stay relevant and beloved by the public while remaining staunchly traditional was perhaps her greatest post-war achievement. She understood that for the monarchy to survive, it had to be both a mirror of the people and a mystery beyond them. She ensured that the institution always had a steady, experienced, and deeply respected hand to guide it through the treacherous and unpredictable waters of the late 20th century, serving as the ultimate arbiter of royal conduct and the final defender of the crown's dignity. How did a woman who never once sought the crown and who spent years actively fearing the golden cage of royal life end up living for 101 years to become the ultimate global symbol of British survival and the iron soul of the monarchy? Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, passed away peacefully in her sleep in 2002. Having lived through this staggering span of the entire 20th century, witnessing to world wars, the rise and fall of the Soviet Union, the total decolonization of the British Empire, and the birth of the digital age, she died not just as a royal, but as a legend, a figure who had proven through a century of action that the true strength of a crown is found not in its diamonds or its gold, but in the sheer unyielding character of the person wearing it. Her life was a masterclass in the art of adaptation and survival. She used her hidden Scottish grit to withstand the terror of the Blitz and a refined, soft power to save a throne from the brink of total collapse. She remained, even in her final days, a woman of immense charm and terrifying will, a figure who could disarm a world leader with a smile while privately steering the course of a 1,000-year-old institution. She remains a testament to the idea that sometimes the most reluctant and fearful leaders are exactly the ones that history requires most in its moments of darkness. Her 101-year journey was a marathon of duty, a century-long proof that a simple, radiant smile, when backed by a heart made of Highland steel and a spirit forged in the fires of World War, can be the most powerful and impenetrable shield a nation can ever possess in its defense. Her death marked the true end of the 20th century. leaving behind a legacy of resilience that continues to define the British monarchy today.